Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if your question doesn't get answered in this video, then please go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, go ahead and post any new questions that you have. And also, don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So before I get started, I also just wanted to say welcome to any of you new patrons out there. We've had a lot of new patrons joining recently, so really exciting. If this is your first Q&A, then I hope it's useful to you, hope you enjoy it, and thanks so much for supporting. I'll also say that there's a kind of Q&A archive that I have up on the MI website where it lists every question that I've answered in these Q&As so far and which Q&A I answered it in and has a timestamp and everything. So I'll put a link in the description to that page, and before you ask a question, it might be good to, just check that archive and make sure that your question hasn't already been answered in the past. Also, a very generous patron recently sent me a new microphone and audio interface. So what you're hearing right now is a new condenser microphone. So hopefully it sounds better than the old microphone did. If not, that probably just means that I have to tinker with the settings a little more because I haven't totally figured out how it works. But anyway, yeah, thanks so much to the patron who sent this to me. Totally mind-blowing. Sent me this super nice microphone totally free of charge. It's actually really incredible. So yeah, hopefully the videos will be a little higher quality, and I'll put a picture of it on the screen right now. I don't want to risk messing with the position and everything right now in order to put it on the camera, but yeah, hopefully the videos will be a little higher quality from here on out. So the first question that I wanted to address is one that I've been getting a lot recently. Multiple different people asked it, I think just this week alone, so I won't go ahead and read anyone's name off or anything. I'll just kind of summarize what the question is, which is, what do you think of so-called anime cards? So basically, a while ago, this guy who is a 4chan user created this website where he talks about his version of vocabulary cards and why he thinks they're superior to sentence cards. Now, in this website, he kind of explains this card type as if it's this really big innovation. But in reality, they're basically just high-quality vocabulary cards. Both myself and Yoga have made cards in this style for years, and so it's not exactly anything new, but this person does create or does give a pretty good argument for the benefits of these cards, and he also has a really good workflow that he's worked out that lets you make these cards very quickly on the fly. And so I'll put the website in the description. He has a little bit of an attitude, but I think he does have some really good insights, and the workflow that he worked out to create cards is really efficient. I think you can do some of what he's talking about, maybe even a little better with the MI dictionary add-on. Yeah, the workflow that he's demonstrating can be used to make sentence cards as well, so it might be worth checking out. It gets a little heavy with using multiple programs and setting them up properly, so if you're not really a technology person, then it might not be for you, but if you are, which I know a lot of you guys are, then I think it's definitely worth checking out. So anyway, now let's talk about this card type that I know a lot of you guys are so curious about. So basically, what he's talking about is making a vocabulary card where on the front of the card you have a target word, and just the target word, no readings or anything like that. And then on the back of the card you have the meaning of the target word, and then you also have a sentence that you mined from your immersion in text form, audio form, and then you also have a picture from the portion of your immersion, like from that scene in the TV show or whatever where that sentence came from. And what he's saying is that the first time that he learns a new card, he reads the sentence on the back of the card and he listens to the full audio, the full sentence length audio, and internalizes the usage and meaning of the word. And then after that, whenever the card comes up for review, he just sees the isolated word on the front, tries to recall the meaning, and if he feels like he is able to recall the meaning well, then he just immediately moves on to the next card, and he doesn't listen to the sentence on the back. He doesn't read the sentence on the back or anything. He just immediately goes on to the next card. And so for most of his reviews, he's able to go through them extremely quickly because he's just seeing the word, recalling the meaning, and going on to the next card. And so he's arguing that by using this method, essentially his argument is that by having the sentence on the back and only referring to it when you need it, you can get most of the benefits of sentence cards, but you also have this upside of you can review way more quickly, because when you don't need the sentence and you don't need the extra context, you don't force yourself to read it. You can just skip over it and move on to your next card. And so because for most of your cards, you're going to know them pretty well and you're not going to need to review the sentence or the context, then you're able to review really quickly. And you can either learn more cards in the same amount of time, or just learn the same number of cards in less time and then have more time for immersion, which of course is a very good thing. So I think that he makes some good arguments, and for certain parts in the learning process, these types of cards might be preferable for certain people. But I also think that he discounts a lot of the benefits of sentence cards. And because of that, I think that, yeah, there's still many parts of the process where sentence cards are going to be the best choice for most people. And so I just wanted to go over what I view as the pros and cons of each of these card types. And I'll also just mention now that everything we're talking about now is for words other than concrete nouns. For concrete nouns, just like the names of people or the names of places, or things where it's just like a one-to-one concept between different languages, like in Yoga's video on vocabulary card, which if you haven't seen, I recommend watching. He gives the example of like, okay, let's say you know what a supernova is in English, and you learn the Japanese word for supernova, which is chōshinsei. It's like, you don't need to use a Japanese definition to learn that word. You can just make a card where the front of it is just chōshinsei and the back of it's just supernova. And you can memorize lots of concrete nouns this way, and there's no real need to do anything more than that. And so, yeah, I think we're all in agreement that for concrete nouns, you don't need to make a sentence card. You don't even need to make a high quality vocabulary card. You can just make a simple vocabulary card. So everything that I'm talking about here is just about, verbs, adjectives, and more abstract nouns where the meaning is harder to grasp and things like that. So first, let's talk about the pros of a sentence card. So the first pro of a sentence card is that it's easy to remember. You have the rest of the sentence as context to help your brain remember what the word means and what context you saw the word in. And so in general, they're just easy to learn, easier to remember. They're just easier cards. And this is very important, especially when you're a beginner in the process, and learning new words can be very difficult and can be pretty strenuous on your memory. So it's a good thing that it makes it easier. The other thing is that, in my experience, it makes it easier to grasp the meaning of the word. Because if you just have a word with a more abstract meaning, just isolated out of context, it can be hard to tell whether you understand the meaning or not. Like, take the word abstinence, like Yoga gave in his example on sentence cards. If someone just asks you, what does abstinence mean? I mean, you could describe it. You could come up with a definition like, oh, it means to not do something for a period of time. But it's a little abstract, and it's harder to do that, to like prove to yourself that you understand what abstinence means, than it is to just read a sentence like, he abstained from alcohol for 30 days. Because if you have a sentence like that, as soon as you read it, you know what it means. You know that you understood it. You have that just sense that, yeah, I intuitively know what this sentence means. And so it's easier to wrap your head around the meaning. And I think because of this, you can acquire words more deeply with sentence cards, because the experience of reading and understanding a sentence is more natural, and it's more akin to what you're doing in real life than just seeing a word out of context and trying to recall the meaning. That tends to put me in more of this kind of quiz mode, where it's as if I'm taking a test in school and I'm just like, have I memorized the meaning of this word or not? And so even if I can memorize the meaning of the word, that doesn't necessarily mean that when I read the word in a sentence in the wild, that I'm going to intuitively know how that word is used and what it's going to mean in the context of a sentence. So yeah, I think that sentence cards can help you intuitively understand what words mean better, and it can also make it easier to acquire that meaning. And the other thing, kind of similar to this, is that sentence cards are really good at helping you remember the usage of words, because you're memorizing the usage along with just the word. And so in my experience, in Yoga's experience, and many other people's experience, when you have a sentence card, although the sentence card isn't explicitly testing you on whether or not you can recall that recall that sentence from memory, by the time you've reviewed a sentence card a couple times, oftentimes I will find that I am able to recall that sentence from memory if I try to. And of course, it doesn't happen for every sentence card, but just through the repeated exposure at the spaced repetition intervals, a lot of times you do end up memorizing verbatim the whole sentence. And so because of this, you're automatically memorizing the usage as well. And this is pretty useful when you go on to start outputting. And it can also be useful for when you come across that word in your immersion and you're trying to determine whether the way that the word is being used is the same as the usage that you've already learned, or whether it's a different usage. And how this can help you is that you can recall the sentence that you learned in the SRS in your head, and then you can compare that to the usage that you're seeing in the book that you're reading or whatever. And so that can be useful as well. So having, basically through sentence cards, you can create this bank of correct and natural usage examples, which then you can draw on when you're speaking and trying to understand other things. And this can be very useful. So that's another benefit of sentence cards. And then the last main benefit I'd say is that sentence cards are very good at handling words with multiple meanings, because many words in human languages have many different meanings. Sometimes the meanings are related, sometimes they're quite different. And so with a sentence card, even if a word has 10 different meanings, well, this isn't a problem because you only have to recall the meaning that that word is being used as in that particular sentence. Whereas if the word was just there in isolation, how do you know which meaning to recall? Do you try to recall all of them? You just choose one at random? It can get more tricky. So those are the pros of sentence cards. The cons of sentence cards are that, first of all, they can create more context-dependent memories. So basically, if you always recall the meaning of a word when that word is contained within a certain sentence, then a lot of times you end up just memorizing that sentence instead of the target word. And then when you see that target word out of context or in a different context, you're not able to draw the connection and remember what the word means, or even recognize that you know that word. And so this is a potential downside. In my experience, this was never too big of an issue. And even when I made vocabulary cards, I'd still suffer from the same issue, because even if you have a vocabulary card, you're still making a pretty context-dependent memory, because every time you review a card, it's in the context of doing your Anki reviews. Well, your brain is going to be in a certain mode. It's going to be an Anki review mode, and it's still going to make memories that are harder to access when you're not in that Anki review mode, and when it shows up in the context of a sentence contained within a book that you're reading for the first time. So even if you make vocabulary cards, you're still going to suffer from that issue of having a word in your SRS that you can nail every time, but when it shows up in a book, it doesn't register. Yeah, that issue is still going to come up. I can see that, yeah, it might come up, that issue might come up more with sentence cards, because you're making an even more context-dependent memory, because not only is that memory being associated with the context of the SRS, but it's being associated with the context of that particular sentence. And this is why I don't recommend putting pictures on the front of sentence cards, because that's making the memory even more context dependent. You have even more clues to help you remember the word that you're not going to have in the wild. But in my experience, if it's just a sentence, especially once I got past the beginner stage, I didn't really have any issues with having my knowledge transfer from the SRS to real life, even when I made sentence cards. So this is definitely an issue, but it's not very detrimental in my experience. And then the other main con of a sentence card is that it takes a lot of time. And I'd say this is the main con, and this is the main pro of vocabulary cards. So now moving on to the vocabulary cards. So the biggest pro by far is that they're very quick to rep. And this is significant because the quicker that you can review your cards, then the more you can learn. So there's definitely that benefit. And then the other one that I kind of just mentioned is that the memories that you create are going to be less context dependent. And so we can expect that you'll have that issue of where you're reading a book, you come across a word and you feel like you've never seen that word before, even though that actually you have a card for it. That phenomenon will probably happen less, so that's a benefit. And then another benefit is that, well, what this person is saying is that if you put sentences on the back of your vocabulary cards, then you can get some of the benefits of sentence cards. Like you can still get some exposure to how that word is used in a more natural context, and that can help you intuit the meaning more and get exposure to the usage. But I think that this level of benefit is going to be significantly reduced compared to a sentence card, because most of the time that you review the card, according to this person, you're just ignoring the sentence that's on the back and you're just seeing the word in isolation, recalling the meaning. So it's questionable how much benefit you're going to get from having that sentence on the back in the long term. And then the cons of the vocabulary card are that Like I mentioned in the sentence cards section, I think it's a lot harder to grasp the meaning of a word in isolation than it is to grasp the meaning of a word that's used within a sentence. So, if you had a card that just had abstinence on the front and you had to just recall the meaning of abstinence, for me, that's kind of hard to do. It takes more mental effort than to just read a sentence like he has abstained from alcohol for 30 days or something like that, because that's more natural for my brain to understand. It's easier for me to tell that I understand it. And so for me, that's a con of the sentence card. It's more awkward to try to just recall what the meaning is when the word's in isolation. Also, if words have multiple meanings, then vocabulary cards are very bad at handling this, because let's say that a word has multiple meanings, you create a card to learn one of those meanings, and then later on you create a second vocabulary card to learn one of the other meanings. And now when that card comes up, you're unable to tell which meaning that card is asking you to recall. So yeah, I'm not really sure how people are supposed to deal with this with vocabulary cards. I think that can be pretty tricky because a lot of words have multiple meanings. And then the other con is that I don't think it helps you learn the usages of words nearly as well, because most of the time, like I kind of said, you're not actually looking at the sentence card, at the sentence on the back. And so you're not benefiting from it. You're just recalling the vague meaning of the word or the general meaning, but you're not getting exposure or reinforcing how that word is used. So you're going to walk away knowing the word to a lesser degree than you would if you had a sentence card and you read that whole sentence every single review. So overall, to summarize, I think the way that I think about it is that sentence cards are, the benefit is that they teach you the word to a higher standard in the long run, but they take longer to review. And the benefit of the vocabulary cards is that although they don't teach you each word as well, you can learn a lot more in the same period of time, and that's pretty significant. And so given all of this, the way that I think about it is that it's probably going to be the intermediate kind of part of the language learning process when you're an intermediate learner, that there's a lot of potential to benefit from these high quality vocabulary cards. Because when you're a beginner and you have no internal infrastructure related to your target language, learning new words and memorizing new words is very difficult, and it's pretty strenuous for your memory. And so I think sentence cards are going to be beneficial because they're just easier to remember. They make it easier to learn words. And so that's going to be really crucial at the beginning when learning words is quite difficult. And then once you're an advanced learner and you're learning words that are very uncommon and they're only going to come up once or twice a year, well, once you get to that point, you can't really rely on your immersion to teach you the specific nuance of words and the specific usage of words. And so you're going to want to rely on the SRS more to help you more fully acquire words. And so I think sentence cards are going to be better because they really ingrain the exact usage of that word. And so if there ever is a rare situation where you have to use that word yourself, then you can trust that you're going to know how to use that. Whereas for a vocabulary card that's not going to reinforce the usage and things like that as much, that's going to not be as helpful for very rare words where, because you only see them every 6 months or every year, you can't really rely on your immersion to reinforce it. But in the intermediate stages, you're at a point where you have a foundation in the language, so learning words isn't quite so difficult, or isn't quite as difficult as it was when you were a beginner. But there's also still many common words that you don't know yet. So most of the words that you're learning, you still see very regularly in your immersion. And so in this stage, I think it makes sense to learn as many words as possible in the SRS to a lower standard, and then just rely on immersion to basically flesh out your understanding of all those words. So another way to say that same idea is that you use the SRS to create mental dictionary entries, and then you rely on your immersion to flesh out those mental dictionary entries and help you acquire the word more fully. And I think this makes a lot of sense because if the words you're learning are coming up a lot in your immersion, then yeah, you can reinforce them. And so basically, you can reinforce all the different words that you have mental dictionary entries for in your head simultaneously when you're doing immersion. That's what's happening. That's the real power of immersion. You're learning on many different levels and reinforcing many different things all at the same time. And so you want to just spend your SRS time learning creating as many new mental dictionary entries as possible, so that when you go to your immersion, you can actually absorb more per minute, so to speak. And so I think that strategy is going to make sense. So yeah, overall, that's kind of how I view all the pros and cons and how they all fit in. So I definitely think there's room for these high quality vocabulary cards. I also think it's going to be a personal preference thing. Some people might find it more natural to recall the meaning of a word that is just there isolated without any context. And so they might really prefer these type of high quality vocabulary cards. Others like myself find it more awkward to recall the meaning of a word in isolation and prefer to have a sentence there. Obviously, sentence cards work because I use them to reach fluency. Yoga used them to reach fluency. Many other people have, so it's kind of tried and true. But I don't doubt that these other cards are effective as well. Lots of people have been benefiting from them. And the bottom line is the way that you formulate your cards doesn't matter that much. Ultimately, as long as you're using the SRS to memorize things that you discovered in your immersion and you're doing lots of immersion, you're going to make progress, and everything else is kind of just the nitty-gritty details that does make a difference and is worth optimizing for, but isn't really going to make or break anything. So I like talking about these little details when it comes to cards, but just remember, you don't need to get too caught up in all of this. Ultimately, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. But yeah, if any of the ideas that I'm talking about here with the vocabulary cards sound useful, then maybe check out that site and try it out for yourself. Tell me what your experiences are. If a lot of people try this technique and a lot of people really seem to find good results with it, then I can start talking about it more, maybe experiment more with it myself and talk about it more on the website as well. But for now, publicly, I talk about sentence cards because they're very easy to do. They're very tried and true. It's hard to kind of mess up the process. Whereas with these vocabulary cards, I think to really execute what the guy who made that site is talking about and benefit from the context on the back without wasting too much time on it, like looking at the sentence at the optimal time and ignoring the sentence on the back when it's not, when looking at it would not be optimal, is something that I think is hard to get the hang of for many people. And so it's kind of like you got to figure out how to use this card type to benefit from it as much as possible. And I feel like that's going to be harder for some people. So it's easier to teach people how to do sentence cards and to teach them how to do these vocabulary cards, where you have to make that choice of like, am I going to read the sentence or not? Or did I understand it well enough or not? And things like that. But anyway, yeah, I think there's potential there still. So check it out if you're interested and let me know how things go. But I do feel like the name anime cards, which is what he calls them, is a little cringy, and they're essentially just high quality vocab cards. So I would just call them that. But yeah, anyway. So now on to the normal questions. So James Ma asks, for lack of a better word, are there thought crimes in the MIA method? Guys, let's not call it the MIA method, because when you think about what MIA stands for, mass immersion approach method, it's just the mass immersion approach. So you should just say, are there thought crimes in MIA? Are there thought crimes in the mass immersion approach? But anyway, specifically, are there subjective experiences that are either not beneficial or even harmful to the language acquisition journey? Examples. I find myself sometimes trying to comprehend Japanese content by translating word for word into English, and then wondering if I'm drawing false equivalencies or mentally grooving myself into interpreting Japanese in a specific way. I'll remember fragments of Japanese media I've consumed, but being unable to recall the entire dialogue or scene, I'll mentally fill in the blanks with some form of Japanese gibberish that I know is not correct. I'll have imaginary conversations with my Japanese friend, and I'll try to form sentences, and realizing that I'm forming sentences by translating English expressions into Japanese. For context, I've been doing MIA for 3 months and am near the end of stage 1. So, I mean, I definitely wouldn't use the word thought crime, because that makes it sound like, well, first of all, that there's anything against the rules, and we don't want to have rules in MIA. They're just guidelines and principles. So I really don't like that idea of a crime. I don't, just like how I have a video called "Is Output a Sin?" and I talk about how it's not. There's no one thing you can do that's going to ruin your whole language acquisition process. And ultimately, everything is a matter of degree and a matter of nuance. So I really don't like that idea of a thought crime. But yeah, there are things you can do mentally that are counterproductive. I think, yeah, there definitely are. I think, yeah, trying to understand Japanese by translating things into your head is ultimately counterproductive. But this is something that is kind of inevitable to if you're a beginner in the language. Every beginner who starts a new language ends up translating in their head in an attempt to understand. And although I do think it's counterproductive, and I think it's possible to actively reduce the amount that you do that, I have a whole video on that topic called How to Not Think in Your Target Language. It's still going to happen, and so I wouldn't beat yourself up about it. I wouldn't freak out about it. I wouldn't get worried like, oh no, I'm going to ruin my Japanese ability by translating in my head. It would just be something where if you notice you're doing it and you feel like you can drop it and try to just understand the Japanese in terms of Japanese, but don't get freaked out if you just find yourself translating in your head. It's a natural thing, or we all do it. And then, yeah, the other thing is just, in general, if you're forcing yourself to output, that's not productive. It can create bad habits that you'll have to correct later. And so if you can, try not to output. And so the example that you gave where you're trying to recall a Japanese scene and you're filling in the blanks with gibberish, well, in a way, that's trying to force output, right? You're forcing yourself to create Japanese. So yeah, I'd say that's not very productive. I mean, if it's just gibberish, like you're just filling in the blanks with like, blah, 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 I don't really think that's going to cause any harm. But yeah, if you're imagining conversations with your Japanese friend and you're like actually thinking in English and trying to translate those English thoughts into Japanese in your head, you're essentially forcing output. And yeah, I don't think that this is productive. By the way, someone's mowing their lawn and it's really noisy. Sorry if that's annoying. But yeah, doing this a little bit every now and again is not going to do any real damage, right? It's like, if you imagine that, like you're talking about, are there anything that are there things you can do that will harm your language acquisition process? If we use the metaphor of physical injuries, then all the stuff you're talking about, it's not like breaking your arm or like, spraining your ankle. There's nothing to that degree unless you're like speaking every day for hours. It's more like, you tripped and fell and you got a little cut on your knee. That's going to heal naturally and it's not going to leave a scar. Most output, like if you just output a little bit here and there, it's like that level. It's like, yeah, you created some neural pathways in your brain associated with unnatural Japanese, like producing unnatural Japanese. But if you're getting lots of input, then those connections are just going to get washed away and replaced with natural patterns very naturally over time. So a little output here and there, it's not going to do any damage. It's just like, getting a little skid on your elbow or something like that. It's not going to cause any permanent damage, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah, I would say most things, as long as you're not doing them in excess, will get smoothed out with immersion over time. Even if some little things fall through the cracks and you end up saying something unnatural, once you get to the higher levels, then you'll be asking native speakers to correct your output and you'll become aware of those things and you'll be able to go and fix them. So yeah, I wouldn't really worry about it too much. But yeah, in general, try not to translate if you can help it. So Very DF asks, I'm at the point where I'm immersing by reading visual novels and watching anime with a 50-50. So I guess he means he's spending half his time on visual novels, half his time on anime. I've been studying for 7 months and have gotten up to 3,000 cards. Getting one target sentences from reading is way faster and easier than listening to a one target sentence. It seems that I can't detect the potential one target sentence because there are so many things that my brain is trying to process while listening that it gets overwhelmed, so I don't get any from my listening immersion. I understand stuff, but comprehension is way lower than while reading. It seems not very convenient to pause while having the subfiles opened and search for the sentence, copy and paste. Is that bad, or can I continue like I'm doing till it all starts coming together and it gets easier to get one target sentences from anime? Visual novels tend to have common vocabulary from anime, but this issue is stressing me a little bit. Sorry, I don't think this person is a native English speaker. I was trying to correct grammar mistakes as I went, but that caused me to kind of have a natural flow. But anyway, so the way that I think about it is that, in general, reading is way easier than listening. And also, it's easier to learn new grammar structures and new vocabulary from reading as compared to listening. And the other thing is that learning to understand, learning to listen or learning to understand the spoken form of something that you can already read is not very difficult. So the way that I think about the process is that no matter what, unless you're basically doing all listening and very little reading, if you're kind of reading and listening in even amounts, then what's going to happen is that your reading ability is very quickly going to surpass your listening ability. And so I think that this is totally fine. And the way that you should think about it is that when you're reading, that is when you're pushing your cutting edge of vocabulary and grammar forward. And what you're doing when you're listening is just catching up your listening to your reading. So you're not really learning very many new things while you're listening. You're just trying to become able to hear the things that you can already read. So it's just, you'll end up just going like this, where your reading will always be ahead of your listening, and it'll always be getting better. You'll always be learning new vocabulary and grammar, and you'll be doing your sentence mining through reading. And then when you're listening, you're just catching up. And so, of course, there'll be some things that you'll learn through listening just spontaneously, or, you'll still, every once in a while, you'll hear some spoken slang. It'll come up a lot. You'll be curious what it means. You'll look it up and you'll learn it. But in general, I think it's fine to not worry about sentence mining too much while you're listening, and instead just let yourself pick out whatever you pick out and view active listening practice as catching up your listening ability to closer to where your reading is. And then it's during your reading where you're doing sentence mining, looking more things up, and really pushing your cutting edge of knowledge forward. So yeah, I think that that's a good way to conceptualize it. And actually, in the new version of the MIA overview, which I'm working on right now and should be out in a couple of weeks, the way that I say it is that for during what's going to be stage 2, you're going to choose a domain that you want to gain comfort in, and it'll have a lot of information on what domains are and things like that. And then you're going to spend 70% of your time reading and 30% of your time listening until you get to the point where you understand most of that domain. And then you're going to flip the ratios around so that you're doing 70% listening and 30% reading, and you're going to be trying to catch up your listening ability to your reading ability and get to the point where you can understand the spoken form of that domain. And that is the bulk of stage 2. It's basically getting to the point where you can both you can both read and listen to one domain that you've gained a lot of comfort in to a really high level. And so it's actually going to be built in that you're spending more time reading initially, and then later you reverse that around and get your listening, you have your listening catch up. So Corey Lalian asks, if outputting too early can hurt your accent, then does that mean saying words in your head can do the same, in a similar way to how subvocalization while you read can hurt your accent? I think that there's definitely the potential to cause some damage or harm to your accent by just saying words in your head. I notice that when I say words in my head, I can almost feel my tongue like subtly moving and my throat subtly moving. And so it does feel very similar to subvocalization. You're essentially just saying the word in the voice in your head, and your physical speech organs have a response to that. And also, you can create habits just by thinking, right? Like if you always think a certain grammatical pattern and that grammatical pattern is wrong, then it's likely that when you actually speak out loud, you're going to make that same grammatical mistake. And same thing with pronunciation and things like that. So yeah, saying words in your head has the potential to create bad habits, but I think in general, if you're doing a lot of listening, then it's not going to cause that much damage in the long term. Like I said, it's more like I said in the or 2 questions ago, it's more like banging up your knee, getting some scratches on your elbow. Like, yeah, you'll get some nicks here and there, but those will all heal naturally over time as long as you keep doing a lot of listening. And so the way that, like I just explained in the last question, in stage 2 of the MI process, you're going to spend 70% of your active immersion time doing reading, but you still have 30% of that time that you're doing active listening, and then you also have passive listening, which hopefully you're able to get a few hours of each day. So as long as you're doing passive listening for a couple hours and you're spending at least 30% of your active time doing or listening to the language actively, I think that any damage that you accumulate will naturally heal and be overridden just by the sheer amount of listening input, and it will be, over time kind of cancel out. And I mean, I think that, if you were very strict about you wanted to do what's going to give the highest probability of you having a native like accent, and you're really willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve that, then I'd say, probably you want to just skip out reading and internally outputting as much as possible. Just go all spoken language input until you can understand it very well and you can start outputting naturally, and your intuition is like completely honed. So ultimately I think that would be the path that would give you the highest likelihood of achieving a native accent. But I think that you can get like 90% of that result by doing reading alongside your listening. And although, yeah, your result might be 10% worse, you'll be able to reach fluency in like a third of the time. So I think it's worth it for almost everybody to sacrifice 10% of those results to achieve fluency 3 times as quickly, because you can learn it through reading that much more efficiently. So that's why it just optimizes the whole process. So that's kind of the way that we formulated MIA. But yeah, if for whatever reason you're like, I want to do whatever it takes to achieve a 100% native like accent, then I would say your best bet probably is to, avoid all outputting and all reading. So Cole McCannon asks, can you elaborate on the stage 3 process of moving from sheer comprehension towards focusing on certain grammatical/phrasing details? Do you have any strategies that could be used for noticing subtle differences early so as to have a high level of accuracy once I start outputting? So first of all, I'd say that you don't really need to worry about this too much. The process of learning to output is, well, first of all, the way that we're formulating it in the new MIA stage overview, or we might call it the fluency map. And the new fluency map is that first you choose what we're calling a home domain, which is the first domain that you build comfort in. And you get to the point where through reading and listening, you can understand that very well. Then you're going to move on to your output domain. And this is the first domain that you want to become able to produce yourself. And in that domain, first you get to the point where you're understanding it very well, and then you continue to immerse in the same domain for a significant amount of time, so that your brain has many chances to absorb a lot of the particularities and details of that domain. Because basically the way that I view it is that if you just hold your attention on something, you're going to naturally notice more and more patterns related to that thing that you're paying attention to. And so at the beginning, if you're not understanding and you're paying attention to it, the patterns that you're noticing are related to becoming able to understand what is actually being said. So the more you listen and the more that you put in the work, then you become better and better at understanding it. But once you've reached the point where you can understand it, if you keep paying attention to that domain, then you'll naturally just start noticing more and more peculiarities related to how words are pronounced, how words are used, intonation, and things like this. And a lot of that is just subconscious. Like, even if consciously all you're doing is just attentively listening and just following along with what's being said, your unconscious mind will do most of the pattern recognition for you. So I think all you really have to do is continue to immerse in the domain that you want to output in, and you'll get all the benefits that you need. You don't need to consciously be going out of your way to try to notice particular things. Most of that will happen on its own. And the other thing is that once you actually start outputting, you'll notice holes in your knowledge through the act of outputting. You'll notice that there's certain things you don't know how to say, or you can get feedback from native speakers to tell you what sounds off about your speech, and then that will let you know what things you have to go and pay attention to. So it's kind of like if you realize, I don't know how to express this idea, then when you go back to the drawing board, so to speak, and you're listening to the domain that you want to output in, you'll be kind of just subconsciously looking for how native speakers express that idea. And when you do come across that, a bell will go off and you'll kind of have that aha moment of, so that's how you naturally express that idea. Or if someone points out that you pronounce a certain vowel wrong or that you pronounce a certain word wrong, then you'll be paying attention to that. And every time that vowel is used or that word shows up, you'll kind of take a mental note and be like, so that's how native speakers do that. And then you'll acquire it. So I think in a way, rather than just trying to proactively be like, I'm just going to notice as much as possible, for most people, it makes more sense to just get lots of exposure. Your brain will absorb most of the things you need, and then actually find out through outputting what you're missing, and then you can go back and pay attention to that. But if you still just want some frameworks you can use to try to pick up as much as possible proactively before you even start outputting, one framework is that I came up with a couple years ago is this 3-tiered system of the first tier is what ideas are being expressed. The second tier is what words are being used to express those ideas. And then the third tier is how are those words being pronounced. And so you can basically pick one of these 3 tiers and then just try to pay attention to that idea in particular while immersing. So the first domain is what ideas are being expressed. So in every language, people say different things. They have different types of ideas. And so you want to be paying attention to, well, what actual ideas is this person expressing? Are they expressing them in a roundabout way? Are they expressing it in a more direct way? What opinions do they have? And so it's more like a cultural thing. You're kind of just paying attention to like what types of things do people say and what reactions do other native speakers give when a native speaker expresses those ideas. So you could just be trying to notice what's happening on that level. The second tier is what words are being used to express those ideas. So this is usage. It's what vocabulary words are being used in what types of contexts, what structures are being used, and it's the types of things that you could notice while reading a book, right? It's just how is language being used to express the ideas that are being expressed. And then the last tier is pretty much just everything related to pronunciation. How are those words being pronounced? How are the inflection patterns playing out? How is the pitch accent playing out? Where is the tone of their voice rising and falling? What intonation patterns are they using? What words are they emphasizing in a sentence? How do the precise vowels and consonants and all the other phonetic qualities play out? And so you're just paying attention to that. So if you just pick one of these three tiers and then just try to generally notice what's happening within that particular tier, then I think you'll make a lot more discoveries than you would otherwise. Another thing is you can study linguistics and study the linguistics of your target language. So you can go in the case of Japanese, for example, you can go and read about how, in Japanese, there's this thing called devoicing, and you can learn about the rules of devoicing a little bit, and then you can try to hear that actually playing out in real Japanese. Or if you notice in Japanese, there's actually two different meanings that the ta form can mean. It can mean that it's when a verb ends in ta, it can mean past tense or it can mean completion. And you learn about this distinction, and then you actually try to start noticing when you're listening to Japanese when a certain verb is being used in the completion form and when it's being used in the past tense form. And so you kind of train yourself to notice this distinction. So another thing you can do is just learn about linguistic concepts and then train yourself to notice them in your immersion. That can help you notice more patterns. So those are the things you can do if you want to go above and beyond. But in general, I'd say just getting ample exposure and then learning what you're missing through actual output is going to help you meet your needs 90% of the time. So Tomu-san asks, hey Matt, do you plan on making a video on the Japanese naming system? I find one of the most challenging parts of reading is not knowing the pronunciations of a lot of these names, people's names. Some of them obviously will show the furigana one time for the reader's sake, but quite often it's assumed that the Japanese person will know the name because it's fairly common. Do you have any resources for accelerating the process of learning this? I don't know if I'm going to make a whole video just on names. Honestly, it doesn't really seem like there is enough content to make a whole video on that, and I'll tell you all the content that I have. So first of all, a lot of people are familiar in Japanese with onyomi and kunyomi. So, onyomi is the Chinese-derived readings of characters, and kunyomi is the Japanese-derived readings of characters. But there's actually a third one called nanori, and these are readings that are used exclusively in names. So some kanji have a reading that is applicable when that kanji is being used in a name, but it's never going to be, or almost never going to be applicable when it's being used in a word that is not a name. So one example is if you have the character for ichi, that means one. If it's in a name, sometimes it's read kazu. And it's very rare to come across a word that is not a name that contains this character for one, for ichi, and it's read kazu. But it's pretty common for names that contain this ichi to be read kazu. Now, it's not the case that every single name that contains the word ichi is read kazu something or something kazu. Sometimes it might actually be ichi, or maybe it's something totally different. So it's not a surefire thing, because nothing about kanji readings are surefire, but it's just like a possibility you can keep in your mind of, okay, so this is a name and it's ichi, so maybe it's read kazu. So just having this concept in your mind that there are readings that apply to names but don't apply to anything else is useful to have. And even if I never told you this, you would have just figured it out eventually through learning a lot of Japanese names. I figured it out before I knew that there was a word for it and anyone told me about it, because it becomes obvious as you learn a lot of names. But maybe it'll help you to actually just be explicitly explained that there is this concept of nanori. So the other thing is that there aren't very many Japanese names, but there's a lot of ways to write common Japanese names. So, for example, like Satomi is one of the most common Japanese names, but there's many different possible kanji that you can write Satomi with. And this is due to the fact that when a parent assigns a name to their child, they want the child to have like a unique kanji that reflects what they hope the child's gonna, like what qualities they hope that child is gonna have when it grows up. So they'll have like beautiful or smart or precious or things like this. And so basically, what happens when you get good at Japanese names, and this just happens through learning lots of names, is that you'll come across a name that maybe you've never seen before. So like maybe you come across a version of Satomi that you've never seen before. So you'll be able to tell like, okay, so this character, it can be read like this or this, and then like this character can be read to or like to or maybe some other thing, and then this can be read mi or bi or some other thing. And then your brain will just kind of realize like, oh, it's Satomi. Because your brain knows it's like, okay, this name, it's probably one of the most common Japanese names. It's like eventually you learn enough Japanese names where you have a bank of all the possible names. Just like how in English, every once in a while you come across a name you've never heard before, but most names you've heard before, like John, Zach, Matt, Brian, Gary. There's a relatively small number of possible names. And it's the same thing with Japanese. So your brain is kind of doing this pattern matching thing where it's like going over all the possible readings of the characters and trying to match that to one of the common names that it knows exists. And this is a combination of like, your brain will rely on the onyomi knowledge of the characters, kunyomi, and the nanori, because over time you'll build more of an internal database of some of the different nanori's readings of characters, and then eventually get to the point where even if you come across a name that you've never seen before, with pretty high accuracy, you'll be able to just automatically know like, oh, this is Satomi, because you know Satomi is a name, and each of these, like this character can be read sa, this one can be read to, and this one can be read mi, and so you just know it's like, it's Satomi. And sometimes you're wrong, and sometimes it's ambiguous, but even Japanese people oftentimes are not able to know with certainty how a name is going to be read. Like something I'll never forget is when I studied abroad in Japan in high school, the first day of school, when the homeroom teacher took attendance, like a fourth of the names, he wasn't sure when he read them out loud. He was like, Satomi? And then like half the time he'd be right and half the time he'd be wrong. So that's the other thing, is that even for Japanese people, you can never get to 100% accuracy when guessing the readings of names, because there is just a lot of ambiguity that never goes away. But basically, you will get to a similar point as the average Japanese person. And the way to do this is to just learn lots of names. So just make vocabulary cards where the front of the card is just a name, and then the back of the card just has the reading of the name, and you just memorize it. And as you memorize more and more names, you'll get better at, well, basically what will happen is your database of what possible names there are out there, like Satomi, Hitomi, Tanaka, whatever, will grow. And then also your knowledge of nanori readings will grow. And through this, your ability to just be able to tell what the reading of a name is that you've never seen before will get better. And also, the instances of you coming across a name that you've never seen before itself will become less and less, because you eventually will just have been exposed to all the common writings of all the most common names, and then it won't even be a matter of guessing. You'll just know like, oh, well, this is Tanaka because Tanaka is always written ta-naka, and you'll just know that. So it's pretty much like every other aspect of language. You just gotta feed yourself enough input, your brain enough input, and then your brain will do the pattern recognition, and you'll eventually be good to go. So actually, I did have a decent amount of content to say on that, but that's it. So now I don't need to make the video on the main channel. So Liam Tan asks, "Hi Matt, how do you stop yourself from lecturing people on MIA and trying to explain that they're blue-pilled? I have a friend who bought a textbook for reading comprehension because they said using a dictionary and trying to read was too hard, and it was hard for me not to lecture them on MIA." So, I mean, my personal experience is that almost nobody responds well to receiving a lecture on how immersion learning works. And I think most people would be able to just intuit that this is the case without experiencing it themselves or even having to have me say it to them. So that's how you stop yourself, right? I mean, if you know it's going to result in nothing good, then you're probably not going to be that tempted to do it. And for me, I mean, I learned the hard way that this is the case, maybe you need to learn the hard way as well. Maybe you have to go and give some MIA lectures and experience the results of that. And if you do that enough times and you realize enough times that it just never actually works, it never actually makes the other person get into immersion learning, and so it ends up just making your relationship more awkward, then you're probably going to lose the desire to do that, right? And I think things like making language learning friends who share your views on language learning can be very helpful, because a lot of times that desire to go and tell someone about immersion learning, it just comes from a desire to want to connect with other people and have other friends that share your perspective on things. And so if you have a lot of language learning friends that you made even just over the internet that share your views, and you have some camaraderie related to language learning, then it probably won't be as painful for you to have another friend who doesn't share your perspective on language learning, right? Whereas if the only language learning friends you have are people who completely disagree with you on how to do effective language learning, then that's going to just be uncomfortable and isolating, and it's going to make you doubt yourself and things like that. So that could be a good solution. Try to make some other language learning friends. You could also make update videos. That seems to help a lot of people just talk through their experience and share their experience with others, making an MIA update series, starting a YouTube channel. That can be good. In my experience, almost all the MIA update videos are very well received by the community. They have nothing but positive feedback within the comments section, so that can be good as well. The other thing is that if you're really set on selling immersion-based language learning to people in your life, the key is you have to have the results to show for it. You have to actually get really good at the language and get to the point where the other person is able to see that there's a difference between their results and your results, and that if they keep doing what they're doing, they're never going to get your type of results. You have to get to the point where that's the case. And in my case, I did get to that point where I would go and speak Japanese to people. And I mean, I would be in a community of language learners. Like when I went to college a year and a half ago, there was a community of people learning Japanese and Japanese foreign exchange students. And I went and spent a little bit of time within that community. And I would speak Japanese, and the other Japanese learners would be able to tell, like, whoa, this guy is on a different level. And a few of them who were more serious actually came up to me and they were like, hey, how did you get so good at Japanese? And I told them. And some of them didn't really respond, but some of them did. And actually, I know that one of the people who I met when I was at PSU recently became a patron, and I saw him in the Discord server. And so I was like, oh, cool. Like, it's cool to see you. And so if you really want to have a shot at selling immersion learning to other people in real life, you have to have the results to show for it. Because the thing is, it's counter to everything that most people have heard about language learning. And so in a way, it's just like walking up to someone and being like, hey, did you know that the earth is flat? They're not going to take you seriously at all. And just for the record, I don't think the earth is flat. I don't want to create any confusion about that. But in a sense, if someone came up and told you the earth is flat, you would just cringe at them and you would say, okay, this guy's lost his mind. And in that case, the earth is actually not flat, but that's what most people feel like if someone's going to come up to them and tell them, hey, did you know that everything you know about immersion, about language learning is wrong, and actually you have to learn the way that a child does if you want to have good results? They're going to feel as if someone just told them the earth was flat. In that case, it actually happens to be true that immersion learning is the only real effective way to get fluent in a foreign language. But from the person's point of view that hasn't yet understood immersion learning, it comes across the same way that being told the earth is flat would come across. You're just going to brush it off and not take it seriously. So you have to have some kind of strong evidence in order to counteract just the seemingly unlikely and just suspicious nature of the idea of immersion learning, right? If you're saying, hey, I'm going to present you with this idea that seems really improbable, and is counter to what you currently believe, but I have results to back it up, that is going to have a much different result than saying, hey, let me sell you this idea about immersion learning. It's counter to everything that you know. I don't have any results yet, but I'm going to have them soon in the future. And this guy on the internet has results. Now it just sounds like you're part of some like pyramid marketing scheme, right? And you're like, oh yeah, I mean, it didn't work for me yet, but it's going to. And this guy who sold me the product, it worked really amazingly for him. That's not convincing to anyone. You have to have your own results. You have to be living proof that it works. And once you are living proof that it works, other people will come to you and they'll ask you what your secret is. You won't have to go out and sell it to other people. And the other thing is, in my experience, the better I got at Japanese, the less compulsion I felt to make other people understand my perspective. And I think this is just because before you actually reach fluency in a foreign language through immersion learning, although you might believe that immersion is the way to go and you might have a lot of good, like, theoretical arguments about why immersion works, and you have a lot of anecdotal evidence that it works because you know about me and other people on the internet, until you experience it yourself, there's always some level of doubt. There's always some level of uncertainty. And I think this is just due to having a belief that is counter to the mainstream belief. Whenever you have a belief counter to the mainstream belief, there's always that sense of like, is this really right? Like, could I have gone wrong? Could I have been confused? Could I have been deceived? Like, is it really possible that everyone's wrong and I'm right and I just came across the answer? That sounds really unlikely. And so you'll have doubts rooted in this perfectly logical and rational line of reasoning, which is just that it's unlikely that everyone is wrong and I am right. You know, it is unlikely. It happens to be the case in this case, but it is unlikely. So it's natural to have some level of doubt. And so I think in order to alleviate this doubt, you have this temptation to make other people share your perspective so that you have some kind of confirmation that you're not crazy. But the thing is, once you get good and you get fluent, then you have no more doubt because you have firsthand evidence like, oh, I know this works 100%, no doubt in my mind because I am good and those other people still are bad. And after that, that whole doubt problem completely evaporates, and now you don't have that worry about you actually just being crazy and maybe everyone was right all along, right? You know, oh, no, it worked. Like, no doubt about that. And so that compulsion to try to convince other people goes away to a significant extent. So that was my experience. Now, when I just see random Joes on the street who are using Genki to learn Japanese, I feel no temptation to go and try to talk them out of it because I just know they're probably not going to respond well. I mean, I might say like, oh yeah, I have a YouTube channel on how to learn Japanese. You should check it out. And at least then I'm opening the door for them. But I know it's their choice whether they're going to walk through that door or not. And I can't really do anything to force them through it. So that might be a good thing to do, is just say like, oh, well, actually, there's this method of learning Japanese that's been really helpful to me. You can check it out. Go to massimmersionapproach.com or watch this guy, Matt vs. Japan. And now you've done all you can do. You've opened the door for them. Chances are they're not going to walk through it. But hey, at least you did what you could do. You gave them the opportunity. And if you go on to get really good, then maybe they'll see that and then they'll get more curious about what you have to say on the topic. So that's about it for this week. Again, thank you so much for your questions. Thanks to all the new patrons. Actually, I just remembered there was 2 little super short questions, so I'll just cover them. Someone, Jeffrey Downing asks, how did you meet Shawn Head? Kaz from Eigo Nodo actually introduced us. So Kaz is the guy who nitpicked my Japanese like 2 years ago. If you type in like K-A-Z and then like Eigo Nodo, E-I-G-O-N-O-D-O, then yeah, he'll come up. So he's a Japanese guy who's pretty good at English. I actually don't agree with him on language learning topics at all. I think he doesn't really understand immersion learning, but he's a good guy and he's good at English. So yeah, I have some, contact with him on the internet, and he introduced me to Shawn. Michael Ian asks, can we see how developed your pen spinning skills are? So actually, back in the day, like 10 years ago, when I was into pen spinning, I had a YouTube channel where there was no talking, where I showed videos of myself pen spinning. So if you type in Matt UPSB, MATTUPSB, you can find my old channel. I have like no subscribers. I was a high schooler back then, and I was really cringy. So watch out. Get ready to cringe with some of the music choices and weird things I was doing. But hey, I was pretty good at pen spinning, especially considering how long I had been doing it. So okay, now kondo koso. That's the end of the Q&A. So thanks so much for your questions. Thanks so much for supporting, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.